Once upon a time, in the heart of the medieval ages, the sun hung low over the sea of reeds as the wind whispered 1,000 forgotten names. Beyond the jagged mountains of the east, where clouds rested like sleeping dragons upon the peaks and rice paddies mirrored the fading sky and pools of watery light, there came a stranger, lost not only in place, but in time. His boots, ill-suited to the muddy paths of the countryside, squelched with each step, caked in earth foreign to his soles. His clothing, though simple, bore signs of some distant origin. A cotton tunic too coarse for court and too clean for the field, a pack strapped tightly across his shoulders containing maps of lands that did not exist. He did not know the way. He did not know the language. He only knew he had awakened beneath a cherry tree in full bloom, in a land that had not tasted peace in many generations. The villagers of Kawabemura were the first to find him. Children with faces like moonlight watched him from behind reed fences. An elder man, back bowed like a mountain pine under winter snow, approached with wary curiosity. No one spoke a word. The stranger raised his hand in greeting, an open palm a smile, but it meant nothing here. In feudal Japan, gestures were a language of power and humility. A raised hand could mean challenge. A smile could betray madness. Two men in straw hats, their legs wrapped in tattered greaves, stepped forward and bound his wrists with a rope of twisted hemp. They led him silently past rice fields and thatched huts to the local Jokamachi, the castle town, where decisions were rendered swiftly and rarely overturned. The castle of Lord Harunobu was a modest stronghold of stone and wood, perched upon a hill like a sentinel gazing down upon its domain. The stranger was brought before the magistrate, a man with ink-stained fingers and eyes the color of still water. Beside him knelt a scribe, who recorded each breath of the encounter with meticulous brushstrokes. A woman translated, her voice soft as falling rain. She wore a red hakama, and her hair was bound in a ribbon of white silk. She asked his name, his origin, his purpose. "I'm from a land called England," he said. "I don't know how I came here." She whispered the words to the magistrate, who responded only with a slow, deliberate nod. "He says you may be a tengu, a sky demon, or perhaps a drifting ghost from the times of war," she said. "He will not have you killed, yet." And so the stranger was not executed, but neither was he freed. He was placed under guard to live among the peasants in the outer district, where roofs leaked and food was earned by the blister. There he first tasted the bitter tea of displacement, not brewed in a cup, but steeped in the sweat of survival. The villagers called him gaijin, foreigner, and kept their distance. Children threw pebbles when elders were not watching. Meals were earned only through menial labor, and even then, rice was scarce. In this land, food was taxed by the sword and hoarded by the noble class. The peasantry lived by the rhythm of the seasons and the grace of their lord's mood. There were rules unwritten yet ironclad. He learned not to make eye contact with the samurai who rode through the town, their daisho swords gleaming under the sun. He learned to bow low, never speak unless spoken to, and avoid walking through the central path of the shrine unless invited by the monk. One misstep could mean lashes or worse. One evening, as the sun bled across the sky, he saw a man executed for refusing to kneel before a patrol. His body was displayed at the edge of the village as a warning. Flies gathered. The villagers walked faster past the site, their eyes fixed to the ground. The stranger could not look away. Night brought little comfort. His hut was small, the walls thin, and the straw mat his only bedding. The chill crept in like a thief, and the songs of wolves echoed faintly from the woods. In this land, the night did not bring rest. It brought remembering. But not all was cruelty. A boy named Kenta, no more than 8, once left a bundle of sweet potatoes at his door. A woman with hands rough from weaving quietly placed a blanket beside his mat when the frost grew cruel. These were not acts of welcome, but of quiet mercy. In feudal Japan, survival was not granted. It was borrowed, one day at a time. And so the stranger endured. But he was not adapting. He was merely surviving. And this, dear listener, was but the first stone laid upon a long and uncertain path. For feudal Japan was not a place that bent to newcomers. It was a place of storms, elegant, disciplined, but unyielding. A land shaped by steel and ritual, by shadows and silence. And already, the stranger's steps had disturbed old ghosts that did not sleep easily. Little did he know, The path ahead would test more than his strength. It would test the very threads of his soul. The morning mist curled through the narrow alleys of Kawabemura, like the breath of some ancient dragon resting between the eaves. The air was cold, damp, with the memory of night, and the thin light of dawn was barely enough to color the edges of the thatched rooftops. In this early hour, the village stirred to life not with chatter, but with the quiet discipline of those who had survived another day under the weight of unseen rules. For the stranger, every morning felt like waking into a puzzle written in a language he could not decode. He had begun to learn a few words: rice, water, thank you. But words were only one layer. The true language of feudal Japan lay in posture, gaze, silence. It was a language carved over centuries into the marrow of its people. And for those who could not read it, the punishment was swift. The samurai were its enforcers. They arrived on horseback just after sunrise, their steeds' breath steaming in the cold, their armor lacquered and catching the early light like ripples on a black lake. The villagers bowed low as they passed, foreheads nearly touching the ground, bodies still as stones. The stranger mimicked the motion, clumsily, awkwardly, but low enough to avoid insult. He had learned, painfully, that standing too tall or meeting the eyes of these men invited danger he could not yet name. The samurai bore not just swords, but a centuries-old code. Bushido, the way of the warrior. It governed not only battle, but breakfast, conversation, the tilt of a head, the tone of a voice. To violate this code, even without intent, was to challenge a culture that did not forgive easily. He once saw a merchant flogged for handing over a package with the left hand, an unclean gesture, it seemed. Another time, a youth was struck for laughing too loudly near a shrine. These were not the rules of written law. They were customs passed from father to son, mother to daughter, priest to acolyte. They were in the bones of the land. And so the stranger walked with lowered eyes and measured steps. He learned to kneel with his toes tucked under, never pointing at another. He ate in silence, never letting his chopsticks stand upright in rice, a symbol of death. He bowed often, though never too deep unless the moment demanded it. Each motion was a gamble, a guess at the invisible lines that surrounded every interaction. The village itself was split by class and caste. Samurai and officials lived nearer the hill, where the roads were wider and the homes had painted eaves. Artisans lived in the middle belt, their homes filled with the scent of lacquer, bamboo, and silk threads. Peasants, like the stranger now, lived below, near the river, where smoke from cooking fires hung thick and life was measured in calluses. One day, a man named Yoshihiro approached him. Middle-aged, lean, with a face like dried parchment and eyes sharp as flint. He wore no swords, but walked with the bearing of one who had once earned them. "You bow too quickly," Yoshihiro said in halting, patient tones. "Too deep. That is for apology. When greeting, bow slower. Eyes down, chin level." The stranger nodded. "Thank you." "You use left hand to gesture. Bad. Dishonor." Again, the stranger nodded. Yoshihiro continued to visit. He brought him scraps of fish, bundles of straw, bits of advice, not out of kindness, but out of obligation. In this land, hospitality was not optional, it was sacred. Yet it came with expectations. One misstep, one perceived slight, and the delicate threads could snap. Yoshihiro explained the hierarchy. The emperor, distant and divine, a shadow behind the screen of politics. The shogun, ruler in practice, his generals like lords of thunder. Then the daimyo, provincial lords, each a king in their own domain. Beneath them, the samurai, who enforced order with the weight of steel and ancestral pride. Farmers came next, for they fed the nation. Then artisans, who built and shaped. Merchants, though wealthy, sat near the bottom. Traders in profit, not honor. And below them all, ronin, beggars, actors, prostitutes, and those who did not belong, like him. There was no place for a stranger in this order. No space in the puzzle. He was an aberration, tolerated but not trusted, watched but never welcomed. Every kind gesture was shadowed by fear. Every soft word had a brittle edge, and yet there was beauty in this coldness. At dusk, monks walked barefoot through the streets, their chants flowing like water between the rooftops. Lanterns flickered near the shrine gates, where fox spirits were honored with offerings of sake and rice. Children folded paper into birds and let them float down the stream. Even the harshest samurai paused to bow at the temple gates. It was a land of quiet contradictions. That evening, as he helped gather thatch for repairs, the stranger caught sight of a samurai watching him from the ridge above. The man did not speak, did not move, only watched, his face unreadable behind the steel gleam of his kabuto helmet. The stranger froze, bowed slowly, avoided the eyes. When he looked again, the samurai was gone. It was a reminder, one breath out of place, one gesture misread, and death could come not with fury but with formality. A sword drawn not in anger but in ceremony. He lay awake that night, the roof groaning above him, the stars like pinholes in a vast black veil. The laws here were not merely rules, they were a religion, and he was a blasphemer by birth. He wondered, could he learn enough to survive? Or would the blade come not from hatred, but from ritual? The wind answered, brushing the eaves like the hush of a blade drawn in silence. The mornings came with frost now, clinging to the edge of the water basins and painting the thatch rooftops in the pale silver of breath suspended in time. Winter in Kawabe-mura did not howl like it did in northern lands. It crept instead, soft-footed, creeping through the rice stubble, stealing warmth grain by grain from the bones of those who worked the fields. The stranger was thinner now. His shoulders had lost their foreign square, bent not by age but by weight, of labor, of hunger, of silence. His hands were calloused, his nails blackened with earth. Yet his belly, once soft from a life of ease, had drawn in upon itself like a drum stretched tight. Rice, the lifeblood of Japan, was not his to consume. He had learned this in his second week when he had been given a handful of barley gruel and thought it lacking. He had asked through gestures and broken words for rice. The peasant woman who fed him, a widow with eyes like wilted tea leaves, had recoiled as though he'd asked to taste her soul. "Gohan wa kechi ni naranai," she muttered. Rice is never wasted. But that did not mean it was shared. In feudal Japan, rice was currency, not merely food. It paid taxes. It appeased gods. It filled the granaries of the Lord before it filled the mouths of those who grew it. A samurai's worth was measured in koku, how many bushels of rice his service was worth each year. The peasant grew it. The Lord stored it. The soldier wielded it. But only the fortunate ate it. The stranger came to understand this hierarchy by the aching of his stomach. In the early days, he worked in the mulberry fields, helping gather leaves for silkworms. Later, he helped a smith's apprentice stoke the forge with charcoal, sweat painting soot onto his already tattered clothing. Payment came not in coin but in scraps: a wedge of yam, a crust of millet cake, a few salted radish slices wrapped in dried reed. He ate with gratitude, but hunger remained. It gnawed during the long evenings, when smoke from the samurai's kitchens drifted across the lower village, fragrant with grilled eel and broth steeped with kombu and dried bonito. The peasants smelled it too. They said nothing. The scent itself was a cruelty, an echo of meals they would never taste. And yet no one begged. It was beneath them. There was dignity even in starvation. To scrape at a door, to steal from a neighbor, was not simply theft. It was dishonor. And dishonor in this land could lead to more than punishment. It could stain an entire bloodline. So they endured. The stranger once asked Yoshihiro, his quiet mentor, why they did not rise, did not protest the injustice of it all. The older man gave him a long look, then turned his gaze toward the mountains. "When your father died for a grain of rice," he said slowly, "you learned to bow to the wind instead of shouting at the sky." The winter deepened. The sun grew sluggish. Even the sparrows seemed to chirp more softly, as though conserving energy for the bitter days ahead. One evening, as he huddled near the embers of a fire pit, the stranger found himself in the company of an old woman named Mio. She was nearly blind, her eyes clouded by the cataracts of time, her voice a tremble on the wind. She invited him to sit near her, a sign of rare acceptance. "I had a son once," she murmured, as if to the fire. "He went to war, came back with eyes like stones, ate one bowl of rice, then walked into the river and never came out." The stranger listened. "Now I eat barley," she continued, "and wait for the day I forget I am hungry." It was not despair in her voice. It was acceptance, the kind of acceptance one only arrives at after a lifetime of being told that the world is the way it is and will not change. Later that night, the stranger dreamed of food, a plate of steaming rice with chestnuts, a bowl of miso soup flecked with green onion, sweet red bean paste on soft rice cakes. He awoke with tears in his eyes and a belly that felt carved from hollow wood. Desperation, he knew, was dangerous. In a land where hunger was as familiar as the morning mist, desperation marked one as reckless, undisciplined, a threat to order. It was better to go hungry in silence than to eat with defiance. But the line between obedience and survival grew thinner with each passing day. One afternoon, the stranger passed a roadside shrine dedicated to Inari, the fox spirit of harvests. Someone had left a bowl of rice beside the statue. The grains were warm, untouched, a sacred offering. His stomach growled. He stepped closer, looked around, then he heard it, a single footstep behind him. Turning slowly, he met the gaze of a boy. Kenta, small, solemn, the same child who had once left him sweet potatoes. The boy said nothing. He only stared, wide-eyed. The stranger bowed his head, stepped back from the offering, and left. That night, outside his hut, he found a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a ball of rice, sprinkled with sesame, still warm. He did not know if it came from Kenta, or from someone who had seen and understood. But he ate it slowly, reverently. It was not simply food. It was a bond, a thread of silent kindness in a world of spoken rules. And for a moment the hunger quieted, not from fullness, but from grace. It was said among the villagers that a samurai's silence was louder than thunder, and his blade swifter than thought. In the eyes of peasants, they were not merely men of war. They were instruments of order, clad in lacquered armor and ancient vows. Their presence in the village stirred reverence and fear in equal measure. To the stranger, they remained a puzzle, a walking contradiction of stillness and steel. Their movements were sparse, deliberate. When they walked, they did so as if the ground itself granted them passage. Their words, when spoken, carried the weight of consequence. Even their laughter, rare and sharp, felt like the flick of a blade through still water. The stranger learned quickly. The samurai did not bark orders. They nodded, and men obeyed. They did not boast. They acted, and stories followed. To speak unnecessarily was considered wasteful, even vulgar. The true warrior displayed his strength not in flourish, but in restraint. One man came to embody this paradox in the stranger's eyes, Takashima no Daisuke. He first appeared on a rainy morning, a mounted figure on a dark horse, his armor black with gold accents, the crest of a wisteria flower gleaming on his helmet. He rode without escort, yet all bowed low as he passed, even the elders who rarely acknowledged samurai beyond their lord's court. Takashima did not dismount. He simply observed. The stranger, caught in the act of hauling water from the well, made the mistake of looking too long. Their eyes met. There was no anger in the samurai's gaze, only curiosity, cold, detached, like a falcon watching a beetle in the grass. The moment passed in silence, but it left the stranger breathless, as if a blade had brushed the skin of his neck without ever striking. That evening he asked Yoshihiro, cautiously, about the man. Takashima is not one you wish to know, the old man said. He was born to war, raised in a mountain castle where snow never melted, fought in 5 campaigns before he was old enough to wed. He does not smile. He does not blink. He speaks only when the wind listens. But he watches everything, the stranger murmured. Yes, Yoshihiro replied, and that is why he lives. In the days that followed, Takashima appeared more often. At the temple, on the ridge above the fields, seated outside the sock house, where the local retainers drank in quiet groups. He never spoke to the stranger, but the villagers whispered that he had asked about him. He wonders why you are here, said the weaver's wife. As do we. The stranger tried to keep to himself, to move with deference and silence, but he knew that presence alone could offend. In this world, simply existing in the wrong space at the wrong moment was an invitation to death. He remembered what Yoshihiro had told him. The samurai do not hate. They do not rage. They do not act on whim. They are the hand of a lord's will and the blade of a nation's spine. And yet they were still men. One afternoon, the stranger witnessed a duel on the edge of the town. 2 samurai, both young, both flushed with drink and pride, faced each other beneath a cherry tree stripped bare by winter's breath. There were no shouts, no insults, only the rustle of wind and the slow drawing of steel. The first man stepped forward. The second did not move. A flash of metal, a single stroke. The duel ended before the petals could fall. The defeated man dropped silently, his blood soaking into the cold earth. His opponent sheathed his sword in one smooth motion, bowed, and walked away. The body was taken without ceremony. There was no funeral, only a new story to be retold in hushed tones by the hearth. The stranger asked why no one intervened. Yoshihiro replied, "To step between two blades is to ask them both to turn on you." The samurai's world was governed not only by loyalty, but by honor. It was a currency more volatile than gold, more fragile than rice paper. A man insulted must answer with steel or shame. A blade drawn must taste blood, be it of enemy or self. This understanding chilled the stranger. In his homeland, justice wore robes and spoke from benches. Here, it wore armor and whispered through tradition. There were no trials, no appeals, only swift decisions made by those whose birth had placed them above question. But there was beauty in it, too. One evening, he passed the edge of the bamboo grove and saw Takeshima standing still as stone, his katana unsheathed, catching moonlight like a silver whisper. The samurai moved through a silent kata, forms practiced 1,000 times, each motion precise, graceful, deadly. It was like watching a poem come to life. The sword did not sing with violence, but with purpose. The stranger dared not interrupt. He merely watched, hidden, his breath shallow. In that moment, he understood something elemental about the samurai. They were not merely killers. They were guardians of a fragile, violent peace. Disciples of order in a world forever tilted toward chaos. And that discipline, the unwavering obedience to ritual and silence, was not weakness. It was survival. That night, he dreamed not of war, but of stillness, a field of tall grass swaying under the moon, a single figure walking through it, silent, unreadable, eternal. The morning sky was streaked with faint lines of smoke rising from hearth fires, the scent of cedarwood and ash mingling with the cold breath of late winter. Children, wrapped in worn kimonos and sandals made of straw, moved silently through the village, their faces pinched by frost and resolve. Where the stranger had expected games and laughter, there was only order. In feudal Japan, education was not a privilege granted to all. It was a duty reserved for some, and a burden borne in silence. He first saw it in the temple courtyard. The children sat in 2 neat rows upon woven mats, knees tucked under them, backs perfectly straight. A monk with a shaved head and robes the color of riverstone walked slowly among them, holding a bamboo rod. He did not speak unless necessary. His presence alone was instruction. Each child held a small writing board of smoothed wood, onto which they copied kanji characters using a thin brush dipped in ink. The stranger watched as their tiny hands moved with agonizing care, each stroke a prayer to order and perfection. The air was cold, but they did not shiver. They did not complain. Discipline was their warmth. Yoshihiro stood beside him. "They write the iroha," he said, an ancient poem, each syllable used once, a way to teach both language and impermanence. "What happens if they make a mistake?" the stranger asked. Yoshihiro did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward a boy who had smudged a character. The monk stopped behind him. A long moment passed. Then came the snap of bamboo against the boy's knuckles. No outcry followed. The boy only bowed his head and began again, the pain absorbed into the lines of his calligraphy. "They are taught not to fear pain," Yoshihiro finally said, "but to fear dishonor. Mistakes are natural. Repeating them is not." It was a lesson that echoed in every corner of feudal education. In the upper districts of Kawabemura, where the samurai lived and trained, education was an entirely different creature. Here, boys learned not only kanji and poetry, but also the art of war, strategy, etiquette, swordsmanship, and the philosophy of Bushido. The stranger was once permitted to observe. It was not a classroom in any modern sense. There were no books, only scrolls. No desks, only the floor, and the master, a severe man with a face like a cracked mask, moved among the pupils with a wooden sword that struck as often as it corrected. Here, failure was not a pause, it was a wound. A boy who dropped his blade was made to kneel until nightfall. Another, who misquoted a line from the Analects of Confucius, received 10 lashes across the shoulders. Even the act of blinking too often during meditation was met with disapproval. But none wept. None asked to leave. Because to be educated was not merely to learn, it was to be forged. And the heat of that fire was unrelenting. The stranger watched with a growing sense of awe and unease. In his world, education had been a corridor, sometimes boring, sometimes enlightening, but rarely dangerous. Here, it was a crucible. He remembered a boy named Haruto, 12 years old, eyes sharp as flint, posture like a reed in wind. He had seen Haruto train with his elder brother in the temple grounds, practicing strikes with a bokken, a wooden sword. The stranger had smiled at the boy once. The boy did not smile back. Later, he asked why. "He is preparing to serve his lord," said Yoshihiro. "He is taught not to waste expressions. Laughter is not discipline. But he's just a child. To you, not to himself." Children here became tools early. Sons of samurai were readied for battle before their voices deepened. Daughters learned calligraphy, music, and the stoic arts of the household. How to kneel, how to serve tea, how to endure silence as gracefully as speech. Even among the peasantry, children were not idle. They carried water, split wood, wove nets, and helped in the fields. There was no concept of adolescence, only usefulness. And every lesson, no matter how small, carried weight. One day, the stranger stumbled upon a village boy reciting lines from the Kojiki, Japan's oldest chronicle, to an audience of two elderly farmers. His voice was halting, uncertain, but each phrase held the ring of reverence. When the stranger asked what the story meant, the boy replied simply, "It tells who we are." In that moment, the stranger realized that education in this land was not about acquiring knowledge. It was about becoming part of a story, one written in ink, fire, and blood. He wondered, could he have survived such a childhood? Would he have borne the silence, the pain, the weight of inherited purpose? He thought of his own boyhood, of chalkboards and laughter, of books dog-eared and doodled upon. There had been rules, yes, but also choice. Here, choice was a luxury, and survival was earned, not granted. That night, he watched from his doorway as the temple children returned to their homes, their backs straight, their faces blank. One carried a lantern. Another clutched a bundle of ink brushes like a soldier would his blade. Their futures were not open, they were charted. As the light of their lanterns faded into the mist, the stranger felt a profound ache in his chest. He had come to understand hunger, to feel the unspoken laws of silence and sword. But this quiet crucible of learning, was perhaps the sharpest blade of all. The snow fell like silence that day, soft and persistent, cloaking the village of Kabemura in a hush, so complete it seemed time itself bowed beneath its weight. The thatched roofs held the white veil like aged hands holding rice paper. Beneath this gentle storm, life moved more slowly. But it moved, as it always did, beneath layers of custom and expectation. For the stranger, it was the day he truly began to see the women of this land. Not as shadows passing behind reed screens, but as the stewards of a world bound by rules more delicate and more rigid than any he had yet understood. In his homeland, women walked freely in the streets, spoke openly, debated ideas, ran shops, and lived with ambitions shaped by choice. Here, choice was a quiet echo, present in thought, yet stifled in voice. They were not absent. They were everywhere, but they moved like water around stone. He first began to notice it in the patterns of the village. Women rose before the sun to begin their duties, cooking rice, drawing water, scrubbing floors, preparing silken cords, stitching robes, arranging small offerings at the household altars. They did so without complaint, without flourish. Their grace lay in the seamlessness of their labor. And always, they moved with bowed heads, eyes averted, voices soft. To speak too loudly was immodest. To laugh too freely was unwise. To walk without purpose was idleness. Their world was one of structure, an unseen architecture of behavior, modesty, and sacrifice. Yoshihiro once told him, "A woman's duty is not to shine, it is to make the world around her shine." He did not say it cruelly, it was simply the way of things. The stranger met her first not in a tea house or marketplace, but in the stillness of the shrine. Her name was Hana, and she was arranging fresh camellia blossoms before the stone fox of Inari. She wore a red hakama over a white robe, her long black hair bound by a single silver pin. She did not notice him at first. He stood watching as she placed each petal with delicate precision, her breath visible in the cold air, her fingers trembling only slightly from the chill. There was something sacred in her stillness. When she turned, she did not startle. She merely bowed. He bowed in return, deeper than custom demanded. And then he spoke. "I do not know this ritual." She regarded him for a moment, then replied softly, "It is not for you to know. It is for the gods." Her voice was neither curt nor kind. It was balanced, like a blade resting on its sheath. They spoke again the next day and the next, not in long conversations, but in shared fragments. He learned that she was the daughter of a merchant, but had been offered to the shrine to serve as a miko, a shrine maiden, after her mother's death. Her father had wept when he gave her up, but the priest said the gods would bless his trade in return. There was no resentment in her voice, only a quiet resignation. "I do not belong to my father now," she said, "nor to myself. I belong to the seasons." She lived by the rites of purification, of offering, of stillness. Her hands were never idle. When not tending to the shrine, she embroidered ceremonial cloth or wrote poems with such subtle elegance that even the elder monks paused to admire them. And yet she had no title, no recognition. She existed behind the veil of the sacred and the mundane. That winter, he came to understand how a woman's power in this land was wielded like a shadow, present, vital, but never overt. In the samurai household, the matron governed the servants and arranged the household rites. She taught daughters how to kneel, how to speak, how to carry grief with dignity. In merchant homes, women managed the ledgers, the inventory, the quiet mechanics of survival, though the name on the door was never theirs. Even among peasants, the grandmother held the rhythm of the home in her hands, ensuring the hearth was lit, the rice preserved, the family bound together in moments when men faltered. But none of it was called power. To name it would be to disturb the illusion that only men ruled. And yet, when the stranger spoke with Hana, he found a mind sharp as a needle hidden in silk. She asked him about his homeland, about women who spoke in courts, who owned land, who chose their husbands. He answered as truthfully as he could. She listened, not with envy, but with the gaze of someone observing a world through ice, distant, beautiful, unreachable. "Perhaps in another life," she said once, her eyes on the falling snow. One day, he arrived to find her weeping. She knelt before the shrine, her body still, but her tears silent and unending. A bird had struck the window of the priest's chamber and died. She had buried it beside the camellia bush, wrapped in silk, and offered it a farewell poem. When he asked why such sorrow for a bird, she replied, "Because it never had a name here." That evening, as he sat alone by his hearth, he reflected on the roles women played, not as ornaments or servants, but as bearers of unacknowledged burdens. They were poets whose names would never be carved in wood, guardians of homes that never bore their crests, souls who danced in the margins of stories written by others. They were, in their quiet way, the most enduring part of this land. And in Hana's eyes, soft, solemn, eternal, he saw not submission, but strength owned into elegance. The snow began to melt in thin, glistening ribbons down the hillsides as the chill of winter gave way to the first murmurs of spring. Buds of green edged the skeletal branches of the plum trees, and the air held a subtle warmth like a memory returning. But even as the land softened, one truth remained sharp and unchanged. The daimyo ruled all. He did not often descend into the village. Lord Harunobu, the ruling daimyo of the province, was a distant presence, a shadow who rarely moved, but whose will was felt in every crack of the whip, every tax grain counted, every act of reverent silence. To speak his name aloud without need was considered bad form. To question his decisions was treason. His face adorned no coin. His likeness was not painted on scrolls. He was not idolized, but obeyed. And the stranger, like all others, bowed to a man he had never truly seen. His first encounter with Lord Harunobu came unexpectedly. It was the festival of the first blossoms, when even the poorest homes were permitted to place plum petals in their hair, and laughter, brief and measured, was allowed near the shrine. Children were permitted to sing, and women to wear brighter colors, though modesty still governed every smile. The stranger had been helping erect lanterns when the hush fell over the crowd. It moved like a wind, heads lowered, voices stilled, bodies made smaller. He turned and saw the procession approaching. First came the retainers, samurai in matching armor, faces blank with duty. Then monks bearing incense and banners inscribed with verses from Shinto and Buddhist prayer. Finally, seated in a palanquin of black lacquer and gold trim, veiled by thin silk curtains, came Lord Harunobu. He did not look out. He did not wave. He did not speak. But his silence was enough to bend the world around him. The stranger knelt with the others, his forehead grazing the frost-kissed earth. He could not see the man's face, but he felt his presence like heat from a forge, distant yet burning. Later that evening, as villagers poured warm sake into wooden cups and shared humble rice cakes, The stranger asked Yoshihiro, "What makes a man like him so powerful?" The old man stirred his cup slowly. "The emperor is the sun. The shogun is the sword. But the daimyo," he said, "he is the earth beneath your knees. You may not always see him, but you live upon his mercy." In feudal Japan, a daimyo was not merely a ruler. He was the embodiment of divine order within his domain. His word was law. His preferences became tradition. He held the power of life and death over his vassals, and by extension, over the lives of every soul beneath their service. Land, not money, was the root of his strength. Rice fields, mountains, fishing coves, and the people who worked them all belonged to him. Every year, farmers submitted a portion of their harvest to the castle, carried on foot by ox-drawn carts or shoulders bent beneath woven baskets. If the yield was poor, it was not nature that was blamed. It was the farmer. If a road crumbled or a bridge washed away, the villagers rebuilt it, not by request, but by command. And if a crime was committed, punishment arrived not with investigation, but decree. Justice was not blind. It had a face and a seal stamped in red ink. The castle itself stood above Kawabemura, on a high ridge nestled among black pine and pale wisteria. Few villagers ever entered its gates. Fewer still saw the rooms within. But rumors painted a picture as vivid as any scroll. A garden raked daily by silent servants, koi the size of infants drifting in jade ponds, tapestries imported from far kingdoms, and courtesans who walked like spirits among the corridors. To serve within the castle was an honor, and a cage. Every action, every word was scrutinized. A misplaced bow, a late reply, a stain on a robe, each could bring disgrace, or worse. And yet, people longed for the chance, because proximity to power, even dangerous power, was the closest one might come to altering their fate. The stranger once met a man named Noboru, a falconer whose father had been granted permission to train hawks for Lord Harunobu's hunts. Noboru spoke of the day his father was summoned to the castle. He did not sleep the night before, Noboru said. He shaved his head, bathed twice, prepared his own burial robes, just in case. Was he punished? The stranger asked. No, Noboru replied. He returned unharmed, but he never spoke above a whisper again. It was not fear that ruled the hearts of men here. It was reverence. Fear could be escaped. Reverence endured. And so, the stranger came to understand that while samurai enforced the rules and peasants bore their weight, it was the daimyo who shaped the very air one breathed. One evening, as he walked near the river, he paused at a distance to gaze upon the castle, its silhouette bathed in the golden light of sunset. He wondered what it must be like to live behind those walls, to wield the kind of power that could command hundreds with a gesture. But then he remembered Hana's words, the higher the gate, the deeper the silence. Even lords, he realized, lived within their own prison, bound not by chains, but by expectation and solitude. As the light faded, he bowed, not from fear, nor from loyalty, but from understanding. In this land, the daimyo was not simply a man. He was a mountain, and mountains did not move for strangers. The chill of early spring clung to the thatch and stone of Kawabemura like a lingering ghost, unwilling to part from the world it knew. Buds swelled on the branches, and yet a solemn stillness remained, for death had come to the village, not as terror or accident, but as ceremony. The stranger first felt it in the air. It was not the grief he expected, that wailing sorrow he had once heard in faraway churches or behind closed doors in a crowded city. No, this was something quieter, more reverent, like the low breath of a temple bell before its chime. He awoke to the sound of footsteps, many of them, soft and deliberate in the lane beyond his hut. When he stepped outside, he saw villagers dressed in their finest indigo robes, the hems freshly washed, their heads bowed, hands clasped in front. In their midst, 4 men carried a wooden bier upon which lay a long cloth-wrapped form. It was Sato, the blacksmith's father. A man of quiet hands and a voice like wind through pine, he had passed in the night at the age of 67. No cry had gone out, no drums, no urgent running. Only the steady unfolding of rituals that had waited for this moment for years. The stranger followed at a distance, drawn by something he did not understand. The procession wound through the village, past the well, the rice paddies, the footbridge where children once played. At its head walked a priest dressed in flowing white, his staff crowned with bells that jingled gently with each step. Behind him came the mourners, silent as shadows, their faces unreadable, not with coldness, but with control. There was beauty in it, a stillness more powerful than any lament. The body was brought to the temple, placed upon a platform of cedar. Offerings were made, rice, sake, sweetened bean cakes, and incense that curled into the air like the soul departing. The family knelt before the altar, bowing 3 times, then lighting the sticks of incense one by one. The stranger watched as a monk chanted in a low, resonant tone, his words carried not to those present, but to the spirit passing beyond. Each syllable was drawn out like a thread of silk, meant to guide, not to grieve. Yoshihiro stood beside him and spoke in a whisper. Death is not the end here, it is a return. The soul departs like a leaf on water, and the body, if treated with respect, follows the old road back to the mountain. And if it is not treated with respect, the stranger asked, then it lingers, and lingers too long. It was then that he learned of Zashiki Warashi, the spirits of unfulfilled children, Onryo, the vengeful dead, and Yurei, wandering souls draped in white who haunted dreams and crossroads alike. In this land, to die badly was to risk becoming a curse upon the living. Hence, death was not something to fear, but to master. In the following days, the village prepared for cremation. The stranger was allowed to help gather wood. Each log was chosen with care, each branch laid in a specific direction. The fire was not simply built. It was composed like a song. On the 3rd day, Sato's body was carried to the pyre on the edge of the forest. The family stood close, wrapped in white sashes. A silence fell before the flame was lit, and when it caught, the sound of crackling cedar filled the space where words might have been. The stranger expected sorrow, wailing, a letting go. But there was none, only stillness, only the long, patient burn of a body given back to the world. Afterward, the family retrieved the bones from the ashes using long chopsticks. Each piece was placed into an urn with reverence, not all at once, but in a specific order from the feet to the head so the departed might stand upright in the afterlife. They were then buried beside the ancestors. A small stone marked the grave. Upon it, a single chrysanthemum had been carved. Later that evening, the stranger sat with Hana beneath the branches of a plum tree, its first blossoms shivering in the breeze. He asked her why the villagers did not cry. She held a cup of tea in both hands, gazing into its steam. We mourn with ritual, she said. Tears are for the living, but the dead, they deserve silence. So they do not look back. He asked about the chrysanthemum, the flower he had seen so often on graves and funeral cloths. It means farewell, she replied, and renewal. But why not roses or lilies? Because chrysanthemums bloom when others fade, she said softly. They are born in the cold, like us. In that moment, the stranger understood something he could not explain, that in this world, even death was a form of discipline. It was not feared nor welcomed, but walked with like a companion on a long road. It was not a wall, it was a gate. And every soul, regardless of birth or burden, passed through it with bowed head and folded hands. That night, as he lay beneath the rough weave of his straw blanket, the scent of incense still lingering in the folds of his clothes, he dreamed of chrysanthemums growing through snow, of voices whispering prayers without sorrow, of a road paved in silence, and those who walked it with grace. The mountains rose to the north like slumbering titans, their ridges shrouded in mist and the secrets of 10,000 forgotten footsteps. From the village, they appeared eternal, unchanging, immovable. Yet to the people of Kawabe-mura, they were more than stone. They were sacred, and those who climbed them without purpose did not return unchanged. It was said that deep in those folds of pine and snow, the monks listened to the silence of the world, and the world, in return, whispered its truths. The stranger had long wondered about them. He had seen them from afar, figures wrapped in humble robes of gray and saffron, heads shaven, their feet bare even in frost. They came down from the slopes once a month to gather supplies, trade blessings for grain, and remind the village that there was another way to live, one that did not bow to lords or swords. Their eyes were calm, not hollow, but distant, as if fixed on a point beyond this life. He found himself drawn to them, not by curiosity alone, but by something more urgent, a quiet hunger, a question without words. One morning he asked Yoshihiro if he might visit the temple in the hills. The old man eyed him for a long moment, then nodded. You may climb the path, but do not expect answers. The monks do not teach. They only show. He set off at dawn, guided by the faint traces of a trail that wound through moss-covered stones and whispering bamboo. The climb was not steep, but it was long, and the stillness deepened with every step. Birds fell silent. Even the wind seemed to speak more softly. By midday, he reached a stone gate inscribed with characters older than the village itself. Beyond it, nestled in a grove of twisted pines, stood the monastery, humble, weathered, but radiant in its simplicity. There were no guards, no signs of power, only a bell that swayed gently in the wind and the soft murmur of a stream. A monk emerged to greet him, his robe stained with years of walking through dust and prayer. He bowed deeply, and the stranger returned it. No words were exchanged. The monk merely gestured, and together they walked through the courtyard, past stacked firewood, carved water basins, and gardens of raked sand. Inside, he was offered tea. The room was bare, tatami mats, a scroll with a single brushstroke of ink, and a hearth where the flame barely moved. The silence was not awkward. It was full, like a room with walls made of breath. Finally, the monk spoke. "Why have you come?" The stranger searched for his answer. "Because I don't understand this world." The monk nodded. "Good, that means you see it." "I don't know how to survive here," the stranger continued. "Every gesture feels like a test, every word a risk. You speak as though life outside is different." The stranger hesitated. "Where I'm from, there's freedom, there are choices." "Ah," said the monk, "then you suffer from illusion. We all make choices, but they are only seeds. The fruit is not ours to pick." Over the next few days, the stranger was allowed to remain. He woke before the sun, ate only what the garden offered, washed his clothes in the stream, and joined the monks for meditation under the cedar trees. It was not easy. His legs cramped, his stomach growled. The stillness made his thoughts louder than ever. But slowly something shifted. The silence stopped feeling like a burden. It became a mirror. In the evenings, he sat with the elder monk beneath a paper lantern, watching the smoke of incense curl like memory into the rafters. "Why do you live here?" he asked. The monk sipped his tea, then replied, "Because here, nothing belongs to me. Not the food, not the silence, not even my name. And that means I have nothing to lose." "But don't you miss the world below?" The monk smiled gently. "We do not leave the world. We only stop shouting at it." One morning, the stranger awoke to the sound of the temple bell. A monk had passed in the night. His body was already prepared, wrapped in a plain cloth, laid upon a woven mat, incense burning beside him. There were no tears, only chanting. The monks gathered around the pyre with palms pressed together, not to grieve, but to honor his return to the cycle of all things. The stranger watched, heart heavy and calm all at once. He began to understand that in this place, death was not defeat. It was continuity. Before he left, the elder monk gave him a small stone carved with the kanji for mu, emptiness. "You carry many questions," he said, "but not all are meant to be answered. Some are meant to be held until they dissolve." The stranger bowed, touched the stone to his forehead, and began the descent. When he returned to Kawabemura, the village felt louder, brighter, more frantic. But he carried the mountain within him. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he would sit outside his hut, palm resting on the small stone, and listen, not for words, but for the silence beneath them. The rains came late that year. For weeks, the skies had remained stubbornly clear, and the rice shoots began to bend from thirst. The villagers whispered prayers to Inari and Tenjin, lighting incense before shrines tucked into the roots of ancient trees. But the gods were quiet. And then the drums came. They arrived not from the heavens, but from beyond the hills, rising in waves, deep, thunderous, steady. Not the playful rhythm of festival drums, nor the sacred cadence of temple rites. These were the drums of war, and they spoke of things beyond the reach of prayer. Kawabemura was not new to conflict. Its people bore scars passed through generations, tales of razed fields, broken oaths, and sons who had never returned. Feudal Japan was not a land of enduring peace, but of temporary silences between storms. And now another storm had begun to stir. The stranger first saw the signs in the eyes of the elders. They stopped speaking of the weather. They stopped pausing by the well. Instead, they gathered in tight circles, muttering names of old allies, former enemies, castles that had risen or fallen. News traveled not by letter, but by expression. One morning, the samurai rode through the village. Takashima no Daisuke led them, his armor polished, his gaze hard as obsidian. Behind him followed 15 riders bearing crests of black and silver. Their horses were lean, their swords clean, too clean. The stranger, watching from the shadows, knew at once these were not protectors on patrol. They were scouts, and war was near. That night, Yoshihiro spoke to him. There are two kinds of warriors, he said, kneeling before the low fire. Those who pray for a short battle, and those who pray they are not remembered by it. Who are we fighting? The stranger asked. The old man's eyes were dark hollows beneath his brow. Does it matter? The name changes. The steel does not. Soon the demands came. Every able-bodied man was summoned to assist in preparing supplies. Bundles of rice, bundles of straw for sandals, ropes, arrows, oil. Young men were taken to serve as porters. The village's best carpenter was ordered to travel north to help reinforce a fortress in need of repair. His wife wept quietly while tying his travel pack. The stranger offered his help. He was put to work sharpening bamboo pikes. The irony was not lost on him, shaping weapons for a war he did not understand, for a land he did not belong to. But war did not ask for comprehension. It asked only for obedience. Then came the wounded. They arrived at the edge of dusk, a train of limping soldiers and blood-smeared porters, their faces hollow with fatigue. Some were carried on stretchers made of wood and straw. Others dragged themselves on hands and knees, whispering the names of those left behind. The temple became a field hospital. The monks worked silently, binding wounds with cloth soaked in herbs and ash. The air filled with the scent of burning sandalwood and blood. The stranger was asked to help wash the dead. He did not refuse. They were stripped of armor and wiped clean with warm water. Eyes were closed, hands folded, prayers whispered. Some were mere boys, faces still rounded with youth, calluses not yet formed on their hands. They had died before they understood why they were sent. Hana came to offer final rites. She wore white and carried small paper talismans which she placed upon the brows of the fallen. Her face was unreadable, her motions precise. When the stranger asked later how she endured it, she replied, "They are no longer suffering. I give that to the wind." He nodded, but he did not believe it. That night, sleep did not come. He lay awake, the images of shattered bodies and burned fabric dancing behind his eyes. The next morning, he followed the path beyond the rice fields. What he found was worse than the dead. A village, smaller than Kawabemura, burned to its bones. Houses collapsed like broken ribs, tools scattered, the well defiled with ash. A dog wandered alone among the ruins, howling not from hunger but confusion. The stranger knelt and touched the scorched earth. Here, there had been life. Children had played. Rice had been planted. Old men had watched the wind, and now it was all gone. He returned with word of it, but the villagers only bowed their heads. There was no outrage, only recognition, as if to say, yes, this is what war does. This is what it always does. In the weeks that followed, the front shifted. The soldiers moved north, the wounded thinned, the drums faded, but something remained, a quiet bruise on the soul of the village. Takashima returned once, alone. He passed through without dismounting, his armor marked with soot and blood. As he neared the temple, he slowed. The stranger, sweeping the courtyard, looked up. Their eyes met. Takashima said nothing, but in his silence, the stranger saw what he had not expected. Grief, deep, buried grief. And then the samurai turned and was gone. That evening, the stranger sat outside his hut, the warm breeze whispering through the bamboo, and tried to name what he felt. Not anger, not fear. A kind of mourning. Not for the dead, but for the living who bore their memory like a stone tied to the heart. In this land, glory was carved in woodblock prints and stories. But the truth was simpler. War was a tide, and it took everything with it. The wind had changed. It now carried with it not just the scent of bamboo and damp earth, but something older, something deeper. A hush had settled across Kawabemura, one that even the birds seemed to honor. At dusk, the villagers moved more quickly. Candles were lit before the sun dipped below the hills. Doors were shut and straw charms were hung above lintels. It was not fear, exactly. It was respect. Respect for the unseen. The stranger had long noticed the small rituals that stitched life together here. Salt scattered across thresholds, bowls of sake left at shrines without a single word spoken. Tiny bells strung on windows, their delicate chimes warding off what could not be seen. But he had thought them symbolic, cultural gestures, like old habits clinging to newer times. Until the night he saw the fox. It stood at the edge of the fields, where the shadows were long and the earth still held the warmth of the day. Its fur was a pale gold, and its eyes reflected the twilight like mirrors. It did not move as he approached. It simply watched. Then it vanished. Not into the underbrush, but into the air. No sound, no rustle. Gone, like a breath drawn too deeply. He told Yoshihiro what he had seen. The old man did not laugh. He merely nodded. You saw Kitsune, messenger of Inari. If it looked at you, then you have been marked. For good or ill, only time will tell. But it was just a fox, the stranger said. In this land, Yoshihiro replied, nothing is just anything. He learned then that belief here was not born of ignorance, but of experience passed through generations, through dreams, omens, and the quiet places where logic dared not tread. There were many kinds of spirits. Kitsune, the fox spirits, known to be clever, mischievous, sometimes helpful, sometimes vengeful. They could speak in riddles, steal faces, or lead lost travelers to safety, or doom. Yurei, pale and sorrowful, were ghosts of those who had died in pain or without proper rites. They haunted crossroads, wells, and empty homes, wearing long white garments and hair that flowed like black rivers. Tengu, bird-like warriors of the mountains, guardians of ancient wisdom but fierce to those who disrespected the old paths. And Kami, the countless spirits of trees, stones, rivers, and winds. They were not gods in the sense the stranger knew. They were essences. They were the soul of all things. One afternoon, he joined Hana at a small shrine deep in the forest, half covered in moss and cradled by cedar roots. She brought offerings of rice and dried fish, bowing 3 times before lighting a stick of incense. Who lives here? He asked. The spirit of the hill, she said softly. It listens, it remembers. He looked around, only birds, trees, a small stream winding through stone. Have you ever seen it? No, she replied, but I have felt it. As they walked back, she explained that certain places were known to be thin, where the world of the living and the world beyond brushed close. Children were taught to tread carefully in such places, to speak gently, to never take more than they gave. The stranger began to understand that for the villagers, the supernatural was not fantasy. It was woven into the way they planted crops, arranged their homes, and treated strangers. It was in the story of the woman who died before her wedding and returned as a crane to watch over her mother. In the tale of the well that once sang, and now in silence, mourned something forgotten. It was in the way the elders would fall silent on certain days, lighting a candle for someone whose name no longer had a face. One evening, a boy fell ill. The healer came, murmuring chants and placing coins on the boy's forehead. But nothing helped. His fever rose, his breath shallow. The villagers gathered, whispering about Mibunashi Yurei, a spirit with no name, wandering, angry, seeking to cling to the body of the living. A monk was summoned from the mountains. He arrived before dawn, carrying a drum and a staff adorned with tiny white flags. He performed a purification ritual, ringing the bell, and reciting a sutra older than the village itself. Then he tied a thread around the boy's wrist, whispering as he did so. By sunrise, the fever broke. No one questioned it. No one sought another explanation. The stranger asked the monk afterward if the spirit had truly been banished. The monk smiled and said, "What matters is not the ghost. What matters is that the mother now believes her son will live. Belief, like water, finds its own level." Over time, the stranger began to feel it too. A presence behind the wind in the trees. A hush in certain groves that felt more than quiet. Dreams filled with faces he did not know, speaking in voices not quite human. He once found a folded paper crane on his doorstep, perfectly made, untouched by rain. He did not know who left it. He placed it on his windowsill and bowed to it each morning, not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement. For in this land, the veil between the living and the unseen was thin, like rice paper held against a lantern. And to survive here was not only to understand its people or its laws, but to understand its silences. To walk gently through a world where the trees watched, the winds remembered, and the shadows occasionally whispered your name. The morning mist clung to the fields like a veil, and the first light of the sun broke through in golden bands, streaking the sky with promises of clarity. It was in this hour of hushed breath and still air that the stranger first heard the twang of the bowstring. Not a shout, not a clash, but a note so precise, so calm, it might have been mistaken for part of the wind. He followed the sound to a small clearing beyond the village, where the tall reeds gave way to a grove of chestnut trees. There, arranged in quiet rows, stood a group of figures dressed in dark blue robes, their movements slow, ritualistic. Each held a long bow, yumi, taller than the archer themselves, curved with an elegance that defied brute function. At the far end of the clearing stood a simple target of straw, painted with concentric rings. No shouting accompanied their practice. No commands were given, only stillness, broken by the draw of breath and the release of intention. The way of the bow. Unlike the battlefield training he had seen among the samurai, this was something else. There was no rush, no urgency. Each archer performed a sequence of movements, raising the bow, setting the shaft, drawing it back. Not as steps toward action, but as a kind of prayer. The arrow was secondary. The ritual was the true aim. Yoshihiro joined him at the edge of the grove. "They do not shoot to hit the target," he said. "They shoot to lose the self." The stranger raised an eyebrow. "But isn't the point to strike the center?" Yoshihiro gave a small, almost amused grunt. "In Kyudo, to aim with the eye is to miss with the heart." They watched together as one of the archers, a middle-aged man with a shaved head and a face marked by sun and time, stepped forward. His movements were deliberate. He bowed to the target, took position, nocked the arrow, then paused, not in hesitation, but in preparation. When he drew the bowstring, it was not with tension but with grace. His body seemed to shift into perfect alignment with the world around him, like a tree swaying to find its balance in the wind. And then, release. The arrow flew in a silent arc, striking the target not with force, but with inevitability. The group bowed in unison, not to the man, but to the act itself. The stranger was invited to watch again the next day, and the next. On the third morning, the instructor, a woman named Kaede with gray streaks in her hair and a gaze like polished steel, placed a practice bow in his hands. He bowed instinctively. "Not from habit," she said. "Bow with awareness." So he did. The bow felt awkward at first, its height unfamiliar, its string taut but not harsh. Kaede guided his hands, adjusting his elbows, his posture, the position of his feet. She did not correct with scolding or command, only with gentle touch and quiet breath. "You are not drawing the bow," she said. "You are drawing yourself." At first, his shots flew wild, too low, too far, lost in the grass. But no one remarked. Each failure was met with stillness, as if the only observer that mattered was within. He returned day after day. Each session began with ritual, bowing to the target, standing in shisei, correct posture, breathing deeply. The act of drawing the bow became less about muscle and more about intention, about the still point between inhale and exhale, where the arrow simply knew the path it must take. Kaede explained it one evening as they sat on the temple steps. "The bow reveals what you carry. If your mind is scattered, the shot will scatter. If your heart is heavy, the arrow will fall." The stranger nodded, looking at his calloused fingers. "But what if I carry doubt?" he asked. "Then your task is not to banish it," she said, "but to hold it gently and still release the arrow." He began to see the practice mirrored elsewhere in the village. The potter who shaped clay with hands that moved to a rhythm older than thought. The weaver who passed thread through loom with silent reverence. Even Hana, placing incense before the shrine, moved with the same focused stillness. It was not simply discipline. It was alignment, a harmony between body, breath, and purpose. One morning, before the sun had fully breached the mountains, the stranger stood alone in the clearing. He bowed to the target, nocked the arrow, drew the bow. He did not aim. He breathed and let go. The arrow struck the center ring, not with noise, but with grace. He did not smile. He did not exhale in triumph. He simply bowed. For in that moment, he understood. Kyudo was not about domination or perfection. It was about surrender, to the motion, to the moment, to the self that disappears in the act of becoming. The rains returned with little warning. Heavy and unrelenting, they swept across Kawabimura like a sigh from the mountains, drenching paths, darkening rooftops, and pulling the villagers into the shelter of their homes. For days, the sky remained a pale gray wash of cloud, blurring the edge between earth and heaven. The stranger took refuge in the temple, where the monks moved like shadows between prayers and chores. Fires crackled gently in the hearths, and kettles simmered without rush. It was in this season of stillness, when the land turned inward, that he first saw the library. Not a grand structure, not even a building, just a room tucked beside the inner sanctum, its door plain, its hinges silent. Inside, shelves of cedar bowed under the weight of scrolls bound in silk and faded twine. No dust dared settle. Each scroll had been handled, read, and remembered. He stepped in, unsure if he was permitted. A monk glanced up, then gestured gently toward the shelves. "They are here for those who seek," he said. But they do not speak quickly. So he sat. The air was fragrant with old ink, camphor, and cedar. He unrolled a scroll at random. Its calligraphy flowed like water, each stroke bold yet controlled. He could not read the kanji, but the structure alone held elegance, like a path winding through a forest known only to the author. Yoshihiro later told him the library held poems, chronicles, prayers, agricultural almanacs, and teachings passed from one hand to another for over a century. No names marked them, only seals, pressed in wax or red ink, quiet signatures of a life lived in devotion to thought. "The sword may claim the day," Yoshihiro said, "but the brush claims the years." K-Day, too, spoke of writing, not as record, but as ritual. "There is spirit in ink," she explained one evening, painting a single character, Kokoro heart, on a piece of rice paper. Each stroke reveals not just form, but feeling. The stranger watched her work. The brush moved with certainty, not hesitance. The ink bled gently into the paper, not smudging but blooming, like memory. He asked if she would teach him. She agreed, with one condition. "You must write with your body, not your mind," she said. "If your thoughts race ahead, the ink will betray you." So he learned the shape of silence in a new form. His first attempts were clumsy. The brush wobbled in his grip. The strokes were uneven. The characters bore no harmony. But Kade did not correct him. She only refilled the inkstone and let him try again. "Let the brush breathe," she murmured. Over time, he began to feel the rhythm. The brush was not a tool, it was a limb. The paper was not a surface, it was a dialogue. Calligraphy was not about replication. It was about presence, about where the weight paused, where the breath turned, where the ink thickened as emotion swelled. He copied poems he could not yet understand, verses from Basho, fragments of sutras, prayers to lost deities. In copying them, he did not steal their meaning. He approached it humbly, reverently, and with each attempt, the storm outside mattered less. The rains continued, swelling the riverbanks, soaking the fields. The villagers mended sandals and woven cloaks. Children folded paper cranes and placed them on windowsills, asking the wind to carry wishes skyward. In the temple, the stranger copied a verse onto parchment. "When the plum petals fall, who will remember the tree? The ink holds its breath." He did not know the poet's name, but he felt the truth of the words. Hana visited during these days, bringing tea and bundles of dried herbs for the monks. She too had learned calligraphy, though her strokes were neater, steadier. Together they sat beneath the eaves, exchanging lines, never competing, only conversing through brush and page. She once painted a scroll for the stranger, 4 characters across rice paper, their strokes bold and whispering. "Shizuke-san no naka ni michi." In quietness, the path. He asked her where she had learned it. "It is from an old monk who never spoke aloud," she said, "but he taught with every silence." One afternoon, as the rains weakened and the sky softened into mist, the stranger came upon a monk unrolling a scroll before the altar. The scroll held a war chronicle, written not in the voice of a victor, but of a boy who had marched, fought, and returned only in name. Its verses were simple, honest. It spoke not of glory, but of hunger, not of conquest, but of cold. It ended with a line that lingered. "I did not die with the blade, but with the forgetting." The monk rolled the scroll and returned it to the shelf. "These words," he said, noticing the stranger's gaze, "hold the weight of lives. That is why we keep them, not to remember war, but to remember the hearts it tried to silence." The stranger bowed. He finally understood. In this land where sword and law held visible power, the written word remained hidden, but enduring. It moved in shadows, but it built light. It recorded not just what had happened, but what had been felt. The scrolls did not shout, they listened. And in their silence, they waited for someone willing to slow down, to breathe, to bow, to unroll, to read. Spring matured quietly in Kawabimura. The cherry blossoms had begun to fall, their petals dancing lazily on the wind, carried like faded memories across rooftops and streams. Farmers bent to their planting, monks chanted at dawn, and the smell of damp earth clung gently to the corners of the village. Yet even in such gentle rhythms, unease found its way. It began, as it often did, not with cries or fires, but with whispers. A message courier failed to arrive. A storehouse door left open in the night. Footprints found in the mud that led nowhere. Villagers said little aloud, but they said enough in their silences. At the tea house, conversations paused too quickly. On temple steps, glances flicked toward the forest with subtle wariness. The stranger noticed the shift, not in what people did, but in what they no longer did. Fewer walked alone after dark. Wind chimes were taken down, lest they betray the presence of an unwanted guest. The watchman placed extra offerings before the old shrine near the stream. When he asked Yoshihiro about it, the old man answered only with a name: Shinobi. The word settled heavily in the air. The stranger had heard of ninja in passing, cloaked assassins, masters of disguise, wielders of silent death. In stories told far from this land, they were like ghosts wearing human faces, slipping through castle walls to kill in the dark. But here, in the quiet valley, the fear they inspired was not theatrical. It was reverent. It was intimate. Because the villagers did not fear death, they feared the unseen hand that dealt it with precision and vanished before dawn. "Do they live among us?" he asked. Yoshihiro stared into his rice bowl. "Sometimes. And we do nothing? We survive." The old man would say no more. The stranger began to look differently at those around him. The quiet fisherman with the long sleeves, the herbalist's apprentice who moved more softly than a cat, the child who disappeared from view the moment he turned his head. Every silence became a possibility. Then came the night of the camellia. It was a moonless evening. Rain had passed, leaving the village glistening under the faintest stars. The stranger had just finished arranging his sleeping mat when he saw it. His door slightly ajar, though he was certain he had closed it. He approached warily. No sign of disturbance, nothing missing, only a single flower, pale and perfect, lying at the center of the room. A white camellia, unbruised, unplaced by chance. He stood for some time, staring at it, heart heavy with questions. It was not an invitation, nor a threat. It was something else entirely. A reminder. He carried it to Hana the next morning. Her fingers closed gently around the stem, and she drew a slow breath. "You've been noticed," she said. "By who?" "By someone you'll never meet." He pressed her further, but she shook her head. Camellia means more than beauty. In this land, it's also the flower of impermanence, of the head falling from the stem cleanly, like a sword's cut, to leave it in your room. She looked up at him. It means they chose not to act. That night, he could not sleep, not for fear, but for the realization that in a single act, unseen and unexplained, his life had been measured, judged, and spared by someone who would never explain why. The days returned to normal. Planting resumed. A samurai messenger rode through the village without stopping. But the stranger's mind remained restless. He asked Kade, the archery master, what she knew of the shinobi. "They are not the opposite of samurai," she said. "They are the other side of the same blade." She told him of the Iga and Koga clans, mountain-born and mountain-kept, whose people learned to blend with wind and tree. Of training that began in childhood, not with weapons but with silence. How they studied birdsong to mask movement, how they walked through water without a ripple, how they wrote reports using coded knots and string. Shinobi are not monsters, she said. They are tools made from necessity. Not heroes, not villains, only watchers. The stranger asked, "But what do they believe in?" Katie considered for a long time. Survival, observation, precision, and never being where people expect them to be. He began to see the marks left by those who moved without footsteps. A sash tied around a tree at a strange angle, pebbles stacked in threes beside a rice paddy, a door left ajar that no one remembered opening. To the untrained eye, nothing. To another shinobi, a sentence. The villagers pretended not to notice. But the stranger knew better. They had lived long enough to respect forces they could not see. They knew the difference between peace and comfort. One was a blessing, the other a delay. One morning by the shrine, he found another camellia, this one pink, touched by dew. It had been placed beside the old incense bowl. He did not bring it to Hana. He only bowed to it, a gesture of acknowledgement. For in this land, even danger moved with grace. Even warning came with ritual. and even the sharpest blade, when wielded in silence, could leave no wound behind, only understanding. The cicadas came early that summer. Their song rose from the trees like a tide, unceasing, pulsing, ancient. It echoed through bamboo groves, across tile roofs, through the folds of fabric hung to dry in the morning sun. To the stranger, it was like a chant without words, a chorus not of celebration but of endurance. He had fallen ill. It began with a fever that came swiftly and without warning. His breath grew shallow, his limbs heavy, and the world blurred into wavering lines. His hands trembled when he tried to lift his water cup. On the second morning, he collapsed outside the temple gate. He remembered the sound of footsteps, a cold cloth on his forehead. Then nothing. When he awoke, it was to the scent of crushed herbs. He lay in a small, dim room, the walls lined with wooden shelves holding dried roots, folded cloth, and carefully labeled jars filled with powders of every hue. The window was open, and the sound of cicadas poured in like slow-moving water. Beside him sat a woman he had never seen, her robe plain, her hair bound with a simple cord, her hands stained faintly green from preparing poultices. She did not speak immediately. She offered him water, then checked his pulse with 2 fingers placed gently on his wrist. "You've passed the worst of it," she said, her voice low and even, "but not all." Her name was Midori. She was the village healer. Not a priest. Not a noblewoman, but one whose presence carried its own weight, earned not through title but through practice. Midori treated him with a mix of herbs and quiet ritual. She crushed dokudami leaves to lower his fever, brewed teas with yomogi and kudzu to ease the tremors in his hands. She placed warm stones along his spine to draw out the chills that returned each evening like a tide. But she did more than tend the body. She asked nothing of him but silence. She did not ask where he came from, what he had seen, or what truths his heart still struggled to carry. Instead, she offered space, where breath was the only conversation and healing was not hurried. During the long days of recovery, the stranger watched her work. She moved with a rhythm that mirrored the land, deliberate, unhurried, but unceasing. Every leaf had a purpose, every decoction a story. She gathered plants before sunrise, drying them beneath thin cloths, hanging roots to cure in the shade of her porch. Children came to her with skinned knees, elders with aching joints. One boy arrived coughing blood into a cloth. She treated them all with the same steady care. No drama, no fear, only measured kindness. But healing, he came to learn, was not always triumph. One afternoon, a man was carried in from the mountains. He had fallen while gathering timber, his ribs broken, his breathing shallow. Midori did all she could, bound his chest, whispered prayers, laid her own hands on his brow. But when night came, so did death. She did not cry, nor did she harden. She washed his body, wrapped it in linen, lit incense, and sat beside him through the night, speaking to no one. The stranger joined her, saying nothing. When dawn came, she finally spoke. "Sometimes healing is knowing when to let go." The stranger asked her, "Does it not weigh on you?" She looked at him then, not as healer to patient, but as one soul to another. "It does," she said, "but it also reminds me that pain is not the end. Wounds are not endings, they are changes." Outside, the cicadas sang louder. Life, even in grief, did not pause. As his strength returned, the stranger began to walk again, slowly at first, then with more certainty. He helped Midori gather herbs, learning their names, their scents, the rituals of preparing them. Shiso for colds, umeboshi for digestion, gobo root for blood. She taught him not with lectures, but with example. One day, she handed him a bundle of twine and strips of cloth. "For others now," she said, "your healing must become someone else's." He assisted an elder with swollen joints, held the hand of a boy as Midori cleaned a deep cut on his arm, mixed a salve for a young woman with a rash from river water. He was clumsy, unfamiliar, but slowly he learned that care was its own language, and that healing required more than skill. It required presence. Later, sitting beside Hana at the edge of the stream, he told her what Midori had said, that pain was not an ending. Hana nodded. "No, it is a doorway." She told him of a time she had fallen ill as a child, when the fever nearly took her. It was Midori who stayed through the night, chanting softly, cooling her skin with wet cloths, whispering stories of distant mountains where the wind carried songs of healing. "I survived," Hana said, "but I was not the same. I saw the world differently after." The stranger looked at the stream, how it bent around rocks, softened them over time, never demanding that they move, only shaping them with patience. That evening, he returned to Midori's house and asked her if she believed wounds ever truly vanished. She replied, "The body forgets what the heart remembers, but the scar reminds both." The stranger nodded. He touched the faded mark on his arm where the fever had burned through him. It was small now, barely a shadow, but it held a story. And in this land of rituals and reverence, stories were not to be discarded. They were to be held, even the painful ones. There was a rhythm to the village, a slow, enduring beat that pulsed through the hands of those who shaped things. It was not the rhythm of drums or chants, but of chisels meeting wood, of hammers striking steel, of looms clicking in deliberate tempo. And in that rhythm, the stranger found something unexpected, a different kind of peace. Not the peace of stillness, like in the temple, but the peace of purpose. In feudal Japan, the warrior often stood at the center of stories. His sword gleamed. His presence commanded. But behind every blade was a blacksmith. Behind every scroll, a scribe. Behind every shrine, a carpenter who carved with reverence. These were the craftsmen, the quiet architects of survival and ceremony. It began for the stranger with the swordsmith. His name was Genbei, an old man whose forge stood near the river's bend, where the stones turned black from soot and heat. His hair was white, his face marked by years of firelight and iron dust. Yet his arms, though lean, still carried the strength of someone who worked not for show, but for the integrity of his art. The stranger first met him while delivering herbs for Midori. He expected gruffness, perhaps silence. Instead, Genbei looked up from his anvil and said, "You carry yourself like someone waiting to be shaped." The words lingered. Genbei allowed the stranger to return. Not to forge, not yet, but to watch. For days, the stranger sat just inside the workshop's entrance, feeling the heat, smelling the pungent mix of ash and oil, and watching as metal was drawn, folded, and cooled again. He saw how each blade began not with strength, but with softness. Iron, heated until it glowed like the sun behind a silk screen, was folded over and over. The hammer struck in a rhythm like breath. Inhale, exhale, strike. Sparks danced like fireflies before vanishing into the dim light of the shop. And when the blade took shape, Genbei did not smile. He bowed. The stranger asked him once, "Do you think of war when you make a sword?" Genbei shook his head. "No, I think of balance, of truth. A good sword does not thirst for blood. It waits. It endures. The best blades are the ones never drawn." He showed the stranger the polishing stones, smooth, worn down by decades of refinement. It could take weeks to finish a single blade. Not because of complexity, but because of care. "It is not just iron," Genbei said. "It is memory." Next, the stranger met Tomiko, the paper artisan. Her shop was tucked beside a grove of mulberry trees, their bark peeled in strips and soaked in water until soft enough to beat into pulp. Tomiko was small, precise, her fingers stained with ink and glue. She made paper not for trade alone, but for monks, for poets, for spirits. He watched her scoop the pulp into wooden frames, spreading it like a prayer across thin cloth, letting the water drip away slowly, until only the soul of the tree remained. Each sheet was handled with reverence. "You can see a person's mind in their paper," she said. "If they rushed, it bubbles. If they doubted, it tears. But if they breathed, slowly, it holds." She gave him a sheet. "Write on it when your thoughts are clear," she said, "not before." Then there was Masaru, the carpenter, whose fingers danced across wood as though coaxing secrets from its grain. He carved everything: altars, sandals, tools, and toys. His workshop smelled of cedar and smoke, and his voice was always wrapped in laughter. To him, wood was not a medium, it was a companion. He taught the stranger to sand with the grain, not against it, to listen for the whisper that told you when to stop shaving, to measure twice, not for precision, but for respect. "A shrine beam must bow to the roof," Masaru said, "but the roof must rest lightly upon it." In each of these artisans, the stranger found something he had not expected. Not just skill, but serenity. They were not untouched by sorrow. Many had lost children, siblings, homes, but in their craft, they had found a way to speak without words. A language older than language. One evening, he sat beside Yoshihiro and asked why the craftsmen were so revered. "They do not build power," the old man said. "They build permanence. What they shape survives us, and through it, we remain." The stranger thought of the sword cooling in Genbei's forge, of the paper drying in Tamiko's hands, of the beam fitted beneath Masaru's chisel. Each was a seed of memory, planted in wood, in metal, in ink. It made him think of his own world, of machines and mass, of speed over substance, of things made to be discarded. Here nothing was thrown away. Everything, even a broken cup, was repaired with gold. Kintsugi, they called it, the art of mending fractures not to hide them, but to honor them. A belief that even the shattered can be made more beautiful. He asked Midori if she had ever practiced kintsugi. I do it every day, she said, but not with bowls. He understood. The craftspeople of Kabemura did not simply preserve the village. They preserved its soul. And in learning from them, he began to understand that survival was not a matter of might or rank, but of creation, of taking pain, memory, silence, and shaping it into something that endured, something that, like iron, did not break, but rang clear when struck. It began with a single drum beat at dusk, soft, measured, ancient, then another, and another, until the rhythm filled the valley, carried on the warm breath of summer. The fields lay golden beneath the setting sun, and the river shone like a winding thread of molten copper. Even the cicadas seemed to still in anticipation. The festival of the returning spirits had begun. For weeks, the villagers had prepared. Lanterns were shaped from washi paper, painted with delicate flowers and calligraphy. Bamboo poles were cleaned and set upright, streamers tied to their tips. Children practiced dances in secret corners, their laughter like startled birds. Even the oldest residents wore new robes, save for this single night. It was the time when the veil was thinnest, when the souls of ancestors were said to return, guided by fire and memory, a time of both celebration and reverence. The stranger watched as the village transformed. By mid-afternoon, every doorway bore a charm, every window a strand of folded paper cranes. Women braided their hair with sprigs of mint and plum blossom, men dressed in clean yukata, feet wrapped in straw sandals freshly woven. Hana arrived at his door just as the sky turned amber. She wore white and violet, her sleeves long and graceful, a single camellia tucked behind her ear. In her hands, she held a lantern, a simple one, painted with swirling waves and a crane in flight. "For someone you miss," she said quietly. He took it with both hands, unsure if it was meant for someone she had lost or someone he had. They walked together to the riverbank, where hundreds had gathered. The monks began the chanting, low, harmonious, like the breath of the earth itself. One by one, the villagers stepped forward, placing their lanterns upon the water. The flames flickered, then floated. Soft globes of golden light drifting down the current, their reflections shimmering like ghostly twins. The stranger knelt beside the water. He placed his lantern with care. He did not speak a name. He had no grave to point toward. But in his heart, he thought of those he had left behind, family perhaps, or a life not fully mourned. The lantern drifted out, joining the others, swaying gently as if listening. Behind them, the drums deepened. Dancers emerged in a wide circle, arms raised like cranes, movements slow and spiraling. Children ran between the adults, giggling and weaving through the crowd, their lanterns still glowing. Rice wine flowed. Steamed buns were passed around. Even Genbei the swordsmith laughed aloud as he dropped a sweet rice cake into the hand of a young boy. For a few precious hours, the burdens of the world seemed distant. The samurai did not patrol tonight. The taxes did not weigh. Even the quiet rivalries between merchant families paused. Old feuds dissolved in music. Hands once used to carve wood till soil or pour tea now clapped in rhythm. Kaide, the archer, danced with a calm elegance that echoed the form she showed with bow in hand. Midori watched from the edge, smiling gently, her hands folded like a prayer. And in that moment, the stranger saw something he had never truly witnessed here. Joy. Not loud, not wild, but deep. A joy born not from plenty, but from the rare and fragile beauty of togetherness. The kind of joy that only those who have suffered, waited, endured can truly recognize. Hana turned to him. "Do you see it now?" she asked. He nodded, unable to speak. "The ancestors walk among us tonight," she whispered. Not in fear, not in sorrow, but in warmth, in laughter. As the night deepened, the river grew brighter, a silver current alive with fire. The lanterns drifted farther until they became stars upon the surface. The wind carried the scent of incense and plum wine, and the chanting shifted into song. He wandered from the crowd, drawn toward the edge of the woods. There, beneath the shadows of cedar trees, he saw a single figure, cloaked, still, watching the river from afar. He could not see the face, but something about the posture felt familiar, balanced, unmoving, like an arrow knocked but not loosed. He bowed, unsure why. The figure returned the gesture, then stepped back into the darkness. Not all visitors came to celebrate. Some, perhaps, came to remember. When he returned to the riverbank, the crowd had begun to dwindle. Children now lay sleeping on their mothers' laps. The last of the lanterns had been released, and the drums had softened, their rhythm like a heartbeat fading into sleep. Hana handed him a final cup of sweet sake. "For dreams," she said. He drank it slowly, letting its warmth spread through his chest like the memory of light. That night, lying beneath his open window, the sound of the river still in his ears, he thought about how fleeting joy could be, how easily it was swept away, and yet how stubbornly it returned. In a bough, in a lantern, in a festival dance beneath the stars, because even in a world shaped by war, drought, and silence, the heart still remembered how to glow. The festival had passed, leaving behind a village quieter than before. The lanterns had long since drifted downstream, their paper husks scattered in the reeds. The songs had faded into the wind, and the scent of incense lingered like a memory unwilling to be dismissed. But life resumed, and with it came the inevitability of farewells. The stranger first noticed it in small ways. A merchant's apprentice rolling up his mat earlier than usual, folding his belongings with slow hands. A farmer standing longer than necessary beside his fields, as if memorizing the way the light curved through the grain. A widow lighting 2 candles instead of 1. Goodbyes were not spoken here. They were shown, in the way a bowl was washed twice instead of once, in the way an old woman touched the edge of a doorway as she passed through it, in the way a neighbor left a small bundle of pickled plum on a doorstep, wrapped not in words but in silence. One morning, Yoshihiro summoned the stranger early. "I must leave the village for a time," he said, wrapping a thin scarf around his shoulders. "My brother in the north is ill. His rice has failed. There is no one else." The stranger bowed low, unsure of what to say. "You have learned much," Yoshihiro continued, "but learning is not the same as knowing. That comes with loss." The old man did not ask for anything. He did not give a blessing. He only placed a single leaf, dry, pressed flat, into the stranger's palm. "It's from the tree beneath which my mother died," he said. "When I return, show me where you planted it." Then he was gone, before the rooster crowed. The stranger felt the space Yoshihiro left behind, not as absence, but as a question unanswered. It lingered in the way the rice rustled, in the empty stool by the tea house, in the shadow that did not pass by his window at dusk. Farewells, he realized, were not always meant to be final, but they were always meant to be felt. Later that week, Midori treated a girl with a persistent cough. Her family had decided to send her to relatives in a more temperate province. The air will heal her, they said, though everyone knew it was the harvest they sought. The girl came to Midori's doorway one last time. She brought a bundle of herbs and a single flower carved from pine wood. "I carved it myself," she said, her voice thin but steady, "so the spirits know where I came from." Midori placed the carving on her altar. "She may never return," she whispered, "but something of her will." The stranger asked Hana as they walked by the stream one evening, why farewells here were so quiet. She paused. "Because words are heavy," she said, "too heavy to carry through life." "But don't you want to tell someone what they meant before they go?" She smiled faintly. "We do, but not with speech. We tell them in the way we serve tea, in the way we sweep the path for their feet, in the way we look at the place they once sat." "Is that enough?" "It has to be." A week later, a craftsman named Masaru, who had taught the stranger how to listen to wood, was summoned by a daimyo from a distant region to help construct a mountain shrine. The news was shared not in ceremony, but in the way he wrapped his tools with extra care, in the way he left behind a small wooden figure of Jizo, the protector of travelers, beside the stone bridge. Before he left, he gave the stranger a single nail, unused, perfectly shaped. "Don't use it," he said. "Just carry it, in case you forget how much effort a single point of connection takes." And then he walked away, his pack slung over his shoulder, the road greeting his steps with dust and distance. The stranger kept the nail close. For all the quiet, partings hurt, there was no wailing, no clinging, but there were traces, left like fingerprints on memory. A bowl still warm where someone used to sit. A teacup turned upside down to signal its last use. A door left slightly open, not from forgetfulness, but hope. He thought of his own past, the goodbyes he had rushed, the ones he had avoided, the words he had swallowed. Here, no one rushed, no one avoided. They simply allowed absence to shape the space it once filled. One night, as the stars shimmered like distant lanterns, he sat outside his hut and wrote a single line on Tomiko's paper. The blossom does not mourn its fall, it simply lets go. He folded the page and placed it beside the camellia that still sat near his mat, its petals dried yet unfallen. Later, Hana would find it. She would not ask if it was for her, and he would not say. For in this land, the deepest farewells were not spoken, they were lived. And in the falling of a petal, in the rustle of wind against the bamboo, in the quiet space left behind, they lingered, softly, endlessly. The festival had passed, leaving behind a village quieter than before. The lanterns had long since drifted downstream, their paper husks scattered in the reeds. The songs had faded into the wind, and the scent of incense lingered like a memory unwilling to be dismissed. But life resumed, and with it came the inevitability of farewells. The stranger first noticed it in small ways. A merchant's apprentice rolling up his mat earlier than usual, folding his belongings with slow hands. A farmer standing longer than necessary beside his fields, as if memorizing the way the light curved through the grain. A widow lighting 2 candles instead of 1. Goodbyes were not spoken here. They were shown. In the way a bowl was washed twice instead of once. In the way an old woman touched the edge of a doorway as she passed through it. In the way a neighbor left a small bundle of pickled plum on a doorstep, wrapped not in words, but in silence. One morning, Yoshihiro summoned the stranger early. "I must leave the village for a time," he said, wrapping a thin scarf around his shoulders. "My brother in the north is ill. His rice has failed. There is no one else." The stranger bowed low, unsure of what to say. "You have learned much," Yoshihiro continued, "but learning is not the same as knowing. That comes with loss." The old man did not ask for anything. He did not give a blessing. He only placed a single leaf, dry, pressed flat, into the stranger's palm. "It's from the tree beneath which my mother died," he said. "When I return, show me where you planted it." Then he was gone, before the rooster crowed. The stranger felt the space Yoshihiro left behind not as absence, but as a question unanswered. It lingered in the way the rice rustled, in the empty stool by the tea house, in the shadow that did not pass by his window at dusk. Farewells, he realized, were not always meant to be final, but they were always meant to be felt. Later that week, Midori treated a girl with a persistent cough. Her family had decided to send her to relatives in a more temperate province. The air will heal her, they said, though everyone knew it was the harvest they sought. The girl came to Midori's doorway one last time. She brought a bundle of herbs and a single flower carved from pine wood. "I carved it myself," she said, her voice thin but steady, "so the spirits know where I came from." Midori placed the carving on her altar. "She may never return," she whispered, "but something of her will." The stranger asked Hana, as they walked by the stream one evening, why farewells here were so quiet. She paused. "Because words are heavy," she said, "too heavy to carry through life." "But don't you want to tell someone what they meant before they go?" She smiled faintly. We do, but not with speech. We tell them in the way we serve tea, in the way we sweep the path for their feet, in the way we look at the place they once sat. Is that enough? It has to be." A week later, a craftsman named Masaru, who had taught the stranger how to listen to wood, was summoned by a daimyo from a distant region to help construct a mountain shrine. The news was shared not in ceremony, but in the way he wrapped his tools with extra care, in the way he left behind a small wooden figure of Jizo, the protector of travelers, beside the stone bridge. Before he left, he gave the stranger a single nail, unused, perfectly shaped. "Don't use it," he said. "Just carry it, in case you forget how much effort a single point of connection takes." And then he walked away, his pack slung over his shoulder, the road greeting his steps with dust and distance. The stranger kept the nail close. For all the quiet, partings hurt. There was no wailing, no clinging, but there were traces, left like fingerprints on memory. A bowl still warm where someone used to sit, a teacup turned upside down to signal its last use, a door left slightly open, not from forgetfulness, but hope. He thought of his own past, the goodbyes he had rushed, the ones he had avoided, the words he had swallowed. Here, no one rushed, no one avoided. They simply allowed absence to shape the space it once filled. One night, as the stars shimmered like distant lanterns, he sat outside his hut and wrote a single line on Tamiko's paper. The blossom does not mourn its fall. It simply lets go. He folded the page and placed it beside the camellia that still sat near his mat, its petals dried, yet unfallen. Later, Hana would find it. She would not ask if it was for her, and he would not say. For in this land, the deepest farewells were not spoken. They were lived. And in the falling of a petal, in the rustle of wind against the bamboo, in the quiet space left behind, they lingered, softly, endlessly. The path was narrow, winding gently through the hills behind Kawabemura. Moss clung to the stones, softening each step. Pines bowed slightly under their own age, and the air, cool with morning, smelled of wet bark and beginnings. He had walked this path many times now. In the early days, it had felt foreign, each turn unfamiliar, each rustle a mystery. But now he knew its rhythm. He knew where the sparrows would flutter, where the foxes sometimes appeared, where the wind caught between stones and whispered like breath from another world. He had come to say goodbye, not to the village, but to the self he had once carried. When he reached the clearing, the one that looked out across the rice terraces and rooftops below, he sat, not in meditation, not in ceremony. He simply sat as one might sit beside a friend. The sky was pale with the last mist of dawn, and far below, the village was just beginning to stir. He watched smoke rise from kitchen hearths. He heard the faint ring of a blacksmith's hammer. He saw children running, sleeves flapping like the wings of paper cranes. And in that gentle witnessing, he felt it fully. He was no longer a stranger. He had become something else. Not native, not outsider, but thread, woven quietly into the cloth of Kawabemura. Not loud, not central, but present. He thought of Yoshihiro and his patient teaching. He thought of Midori and the quiet power in her care, of Kaede and her bowstring breath, of Tamiko's hands shaping paper from silence, of Masaru's tools worn smooth from years of trust, and of Hana, not a guide, not a question, but a mirror. In her stillness, he had seen his reflection begin to change, not into something new, but into something remembered, some ancient self, buried beneath noise and speed that had been waiting to emerge. He had arrived in this land bearing the full weight of modern urgency, a need to know, to understand, to name. But none of those things had helped him here. In fact, they had nearly undone him. For feudal Japan was not a place for conquest. It was a place for presence, and presence, he had learned, was not achieved through effort. It was allowed, like ink settling on rice paper, like a lantern lowered onto still water. That was why you would not survive here. Not because the people are unkind, they are not. Not because the customs are impossible, they are not. Not because the winters are cold or the roads long or the language dense. No. You would not survive because you would bring with you the belief that survival depends on control. You would want to shape the world before it shapes you. You would question silence. You would fill the spaces meant for stillness with noise. You would hurry through rituals meant to slow you down. You would see the bow and ask how far it shoots, not how steady the hand. You would taste the tea and critique its strength, not feel its warmth settle into your bones. You would ask what the villagers do instead of who they are. And in doing so, you would miss the very soul of it. Because here, life is not made of moments seized. It is made of moments received. Moments like the morning mist on the shoulders of mountains. Moments like a child offering a folded crane without a word. Moments like the quiet dignity of a door being opened just wide enough to welcome, never demand. You would not survive here. Not because you are weak, but because you are unsoftened. Because survival here is not about endurance, but surrender. The stranger, who now no longer thought of himself as such, stood slowly. He reached into his sleeve and pulled out the cedar charm Hana had given him. It was warm from his skin, the kanji for kokoro still clear, still centered. He placed it on a flat stone near the edge of the clearing. He did not speak a prayer. He did not ask for blessing. He simply left it there, not as a leaving behind, but as a becoming. As he descended the hill, He noticed how every detail of the village felt alive, not in novelty, but in knowing. The way the gate creaked before latching, the way the wind curled between the pots beside the tea house, the way Hannah always stepped with her left foot first when entering a room. He passed the shrine and bowed, as he always did. He passed the stream and paused to look at the paper cranes, some faded now, some missing. And in his room, the scroll still hung, not as decoration, but as reminder. The path behind him was no longer a trail he had traveled. It was a shape he had become. And the path ahead? It did not matter. For once he would walk not with questions, but with breath. Not seeking to arrive, but allowing himself to be carried. Because he had learned what many never do, that survival is not the goal. Stillness is. And in that stillness, something greater than survival appears. Something like truth. Something like peace.